everybody, welcome. So let's see, we've got a number of sessions you saw on the agenda that Scott had up earlier, and we've got them broken up into kind of 45-minute chunks, and we're going to go through some of the different projects that OWASP is working on relative to AI. So let me introduce myself. My name is Steve Wilson, and my day job is I'm the Chief Product Officer at Exabeam. If you don't know Exabeam, it's a company that's for 10 years been using machine learning to look at security data, help find anomalies, and really pioneered what's called end user behavior analytics. And more recently, been spending time adding Gen AI capabilities and released what we call Exabeam Copilot. So it's been fun to actually work with these technologies and get firsthand experience rather than just building theoretical lists. But my hobby for the last year has been running the OWASP Top 10 for large language models. And so we'll get into that a little bit this morning. Just curious, did anybody come to one of my sessions on Monday? All right, got a few. Yeah, let's see. We'll get into it here. So why are people interested in Gen AI security? Because the media has made sure that people are interested in it. You couldn't swing a cat without running into an article about security disaster with a large language model last year. And in researching this, it's actually been happening for years. Prior to ChatGPT, there were all sorts of good examples of this. I'll talk about one a little bit later. And it certainly hasn't slowed down in 2024. So there's lots of interest out there, and that's been powering a lot of this interest within OWASP to do this more. So what's been really fun is that OWASP really quite recently in 23 and into 24 has developed some really mature projects that are helping guide the industry in terms of generative AI security. And so you're going to hear from a number of these today and kind of get some updates on where those projects are. But basically all of these teams and projects are producing open source educational materials to help people understand the world of security in this realm of AI. And I think somehow, organically, OWASP has really become the center of this conversation around AI and security. So it's been really fun to work on, and I think you'll get to meet a lot of interesting characters throughout the day. So, how many of you have prior exposure to OWASP? Okay, most of you. I'm guessing you probably wouldn't have found your way here if you didn't, but I think people understand that OWASP is basically a ground-up, volunteer-based organization. It's kind of like an open source project. It's not a standards body, but what's interesting is that there's so much hunger out there for things like standards now, and the real standards bodies move so slowly that a lot of what we're doing on these OWASP projects has become the default standards. But we're out actually starting to work now with the real standards bodies in the hopes of getting things that are more consumable by the enterprise and business and government and things like that. So just to highlight a couple, NIST and MITRE, you're probably all familiar with those organizations. We've been working a lot with those. And some of the results, MITRE Atlas is something which is focused on kind of understanding AI security vulnerabilities, but it had no coverage of large language models. And a lot of the people from our group went off and started working with MITRE. Everything you see in red there got added as a result. They're nearly one-to-one mappings to the top 10 for large language models and now making their way into MITRE. The other one that's quite important is NIST, and there was a presidential executive order to kind of get our act together on AI, and part of that was driving standards around things like AI and security. It wound up creating what was called the U.S. Artificial Intelligence Safety Institute, and we actually worked to have OWASP join NIST as a member organization, much like real corporations do. And there are 5 or 6 people now from our group who've inserted themselves into this process. Jason, who I think will be here later, but I haven't seen yet, is actually one of those. So he may be able to talk about that a little later in the afternoon and tell you about how that's going. But I think it's exciting to see the work that we're doing here really getting driven into these government, quasi-government standards. And there's really, even beyond that, we've seen this guidance getting picked up by numerous government agencies, getting referenced by Microsoft, IBM, others, mainstream press and IT press like Wired and others, picking up and covering what we've built here as a group. So one of the other fun things that's come out of this is we do have a number of members of the team who have been writing books. Where's Ken?
You're still a pen?
Ken was here earlier. Ken will probably be back later, but Ken drove the first book to really come out around generative AI security, the one that you see there on the left. I got my first copy of it from Ken yesterday in hardback. It looks very fancy. I read the first part last night. It looks fabulous. I am also working on a book. It's not quite done. I printed this on my printer on Friday, but the first half of it is up on the O'Reilly site. If you're an O'Reilly member, you can go get it, read the first half, send me comments. And there are a couple other books that are in process as well. All of these from people who've been working on this project. So, the top 10 for large language models. We did do a whole session on this on Monday. And I'm not going to redo it here. But it is up. It is up for streaming on the RSA site. So if you have a conference pass for RSA, just go stream that one. That was myself and Gavin Klondike. Gavin was heavily involved with creating the first version of the list, and we went through a number of the vulnerabilities, and gave some good case studies and examples. So really good positive response to the list, and we did a survey, got lots of indications, and for a first version of something like this, having people rating it at 4.5 and above, it's clear that people appreciate the work, which is fabulous. But it's really just the beginning of what we want to do. For those of you who are new to this, just within the LLM group, and we will see there's other documents being created by some of the other OWASP groups, but we have 2 going on 3 documents. All of these are free. You can go download them. Just Google OWASP Top 10 for LLM Apps, and you'll get to the site where you can download these. But there's the base top 10 list, which I'd say is really geared at developers and AppSec. Although, one of the things that became clear is there was so much hunger from people who were not in that traditional developer crowd but wanted to understand the vulnerability types, that we had a lot of executive interest in this. We actually had a number of CISOs join the group. One of them, Sandy Dunn, who I think at the time was the CISO for Blue Cross of Idaho. She's gone on to do other cool startup-y things now, but she really drove the creation of the CISO checklist. And this is designed for CISOs and compliance officers. If that's closer to who you are, go grab that document. That's got a fabulous reception. I don't have good statistics because these are open source and people put up downloads of them all crazy places, but I'm sure both of these have been read more than 100,000 times at this point, which is crazy. And then Scott will talk a little bit more about the CISO checklist next. And then also, we are now starting to develop what we call the solutions guide. Now, we'll get into this, but I think one of the challenges with something like a top 10 list is the top 10 list is a list of problems. And while it's great to understand the problems, people really need to understand the solutions. And we do have some mitigation advice in each of the top 10 entries, but I think it's time to start focusing more on solutions. And I think that's where the group is going to go a lot next. So version 1.1 of the LLM top 10 is out there today. I think it's been out there since August. we started really working on 2.0 of the list earlier this year and are now really kicking that into high gear. I would love to see some of the people in the room here jump in and participate in the development of the next version of the list. This is totally community driven. People often ask me, hey, can I have a call and talk about how to get involved? And I'm like, no, go to the website, jump on the Slack channel and just get involved. You don't need permission. You don't need to ask how. And actually, I will just briefly tell the story that this got started back in May last year, actually not long after RSA. I got it approved by the OWASP board to start a project. And I just put up an announcement on my LinkedIn. I thought maybe I'd find 12 people in the world interested in this obscure corner of AI and cybersecurity. And I just said, join the OWASP Slack instance, and I put up a channel. And I had 200 people join that channel in the first week, and there's now 1,200 people on that. Aubrey, who runs our LinkedIn presence in the back, who's taping, he's got 2,000, 2,500 people on the LinkedIn group now, so there's a lot of involvement. There's no reason to just not jump in and start chiming in with your opinions if you want. So obviously, one of the things we do need to do is structure this a bit when the group gets that big. So some of what we've been doing is doing some surveys of people on the expert team, trying to understand the topics as the scope of things expand. Where do we want to go next? And I think, given the context that we started this a year ago, there was so little understood about the topic, not just security, but even LLMs in general, and what are people doing with them, and what are the application areas. That's changed a lot. So you can see here, we looked at things that were either not covered or even just very lightly covered in the first version. There's a lot of interest in these. When you look at the green bars and the yellow bars, people are quite interested in these topics, ranging from, autonomous agents, multimodal, retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. That's a topic that we barely covered in the first version of the list that now almost every LLM application is starting to use. It has a lot of interesting security considerations. So this is giving us some early guidance on where we're going to start to focus our efforts. So at this point, I'm going to bring up ads. As we built the 1.1 version of the list, ads has kind of stepped in as the technical lead on building the list and working with the authors of the different entries. And so he and I are going to go through a little bit of the feedback on the 1.1 version of the list that we've gotten and what it's telling us about where we're going to go next. So, Ads, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you. Thanks, Steve, for having me. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. I'm Ads. I part of the security team at Cohere. We're a NLP company based out of Canada. I grew up as an AppTech child. Naturally, when I saw Steve's post, I thought, let's get involved, and I guess here we are. So,
Great. All right. So one of the things we just obviously wanted to see is who's been involved in this today, who's kind of getting involved. And the mix has been interesting, given that when we wrote the charter for this, we said this is for software developers building applications with LLMs. That's not at all who's been involved in this. So I think one of the things this taught us is we're going to have to go out into some other places to reach out and find those actual software developers. But when you do look at it, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of executives and CISOs have snuck into the group because they're desperate for guidance. But it's actually helped a lot. It brings a much different perspective. And then really security researchers and security engineers. We shouldn't be surprised because it's OWASP, and that's classically who's going to hang out at OWASP. But I think it does tell us a lot about how we can widen our lens for the next versions of this. And then, a couple things that we really found are, let's call them security adjacent, that in some cases we did touch on these in the first version of the list, and there was a bit of controversy about getting outside of a very narrow security band, but I think the nature of LLMs and AI has kind of demanded that we do this, and we're seeing a lot more demand for it. And so, you look at things like data privacy, which has always been adjacent to but distinct from security. You can see that in the middle with the giant green bar. People are desperate for more guidance on how to handle data privacy and large language models. Government regulation, people can feel that looming. You see that earlier with the work we're already doing with people like NIST and MITRE. You probably have seen in the news things like the EU is just in the final phases of putting out some very comprehensive regulation around AI. And I don't think collectively we know quite how we're going to deal with that. But it looks like the scope of that is going to be as big as something like GDPR, that for those of you out here in security probably changed a lot about the way that you do your job, and it's going to impact us all that way. So this is the roadmap that we're working towards on 2.0. And I'm going to let Ads talk a little bit about what some of the steps are going to be. So give you some ideas about how you can get involved too, if you want to.
Yeah, definitely. So I won't go through the slide too much, but it's just to give a holistic view of what we have currently as our kind of blueprint for V2, which is scheduled for October this year. We've got some major tasks and cornerstones, and in a later slide, I've just got a few notes about major initiatives that we have for the V2 project. Like Steve mentioning, it's increasing a bit of verbosity and context rather than a top 10 list. We have just done the voting, collation and publication now. So we're kind of taking that data, working with other teams and kind of coalescing it and see how we can merge it into our list, propose new vulnerabilities and such. So,
Yeah, I think one of the things I often get asked is how did we come up with the first version of the list? And it was a process that was a little bit like this. And I think it's worth maybe for a minute just talking about how that happened and how you can kind of map that on. But I will be totally honest, the very first version of the list, which I called 0.1, I wrote on a weekend having a long conversation with ChatGPT. First thing I'd asked it to do was write me a top 10 list. And it did. And at the very surface level, I'm like, this is very interesting. And then I looked at it harder, and it basically took the web top 10 and put LLM into a bunch of them. But then I had a much longer conversation where I go grabbed a bunch of research papers and I dumped them into the context buffer, and I said, try again. And I kind of came up with something that I didn't think totally sucked. And at the time I was working at an AppSec company called Contrast Security, if any of you know Contrast. And Jeff Williams is the CTO there, and Jeff actually wrote the first top 10 list back in 2000. So I sent it to him. I didn't tell him where it came from. I just said, what do you think about this? And he actually said, this is as good as what people start projects with. You should start a project. So it was a good place to just start arguments at first. And a few of the things in there survived in some fashion. A lot of them got thrown out. But ultimately what happened was we went through a number of phases of just brainstorming where people had a bunch of arguments on Slack. There were some arguments on Zoom. There were super passionate opinions. And what I'll say is interesting. How many of you have read the LLM top 10? Okay, bunch of you. It's hard to believe, but you go back to June last year and there was a really firm camp that said prompt injection is not a thing. That should not be on the list. And we should not talk about hallucinations. And, everything that's at the core of how we think about this now was up for debate. But ultimately the middle part was the most fun, where we basically just opened up the GitHub repo, put up a template for what a vulnerability would look like, and we told people to write your favorite vulnerability and post it there. And I think we had, at one point, a list of 45 of them. And what was amazing about that was we got a really diverse set of opinions about what these might look like. And then over the next month or so, some of them merged together, people formed ad hoc teams and made new versions of them. And then there was a lot of voting and downvoting and selecting. So we do envision a somewhat similar process here. The one thing that we are going to try and do that's really important is we're going to try and bring more direct data that is not expert opinion into the selection of the list and the ranking of the list. When we did this last year, there were no good databases on AI vulnerabilities and exploits. There are some now. There are some data sources that are going to tell us what's a hypothetical risk and what are risks that are actually getting exploited in the wild. And so Ads is working with the team on building a much more comprehensive look at that. And I think just the existence of some of that data is going to be one of the really cool things that comes out. So anything you want to say to wrap up the roadmap part?
No, as you mentioned, the landscape has shifted a lot since we did create the V1. Even RAG wasn't really adopted that much, so we have a lot of context to add, which will hopefully increase our awareness, and also collaboration from other areas, machine learning engineers, developers, and kind of buffer up that missing audience.
All right, so one of the things we did in the survey, we put out a survey. It was actually pretty comprehensive, and I think for people to fill it out, they kind of had to commit 30 minutes of their life, which is a lot to ask of people who are busy and not getting paid. But a bunch of people did fill it in, and one of the things that fell out pretty easily was a ad hoc re-ranking of the top 10. And so I thought that was just at least a fun thing to share. I don't think anybody's surprised to see prompt injection staying at the top, because most news articles that show stupid LLMs show people injecting prompts into them and making them do dumb things. So that's still at the top. One of the things that I do think is really interesting is supply chain moving up to the top. And in working on my book, this was one of the things that was surprising to me, that the supply chain chapter grew to be by far the longest chapter in the book, trying to get people to understand supply chain security in general, because people coming from AI backgrounds have not had to really think about this much before, because there was not a lot of supply chain to draw from. Now there's 5 million models on Hugging Face of very questionable origin in a lot of cases. But you see some of the other ones moving around as well. What were some of the observations you had?
Yeah, to be honest, even supply chain, like Steve mentioned, I'm sure most people saw the shadow array vulnerabilities that were discovered in November last year. There's definitely a clear gap of data lineage and model lineage when it comes to supply chain. Cyclone DX was July last year that they published ML Bomb as a framework, and it's still definitely not being adopted. So, there are others. One thing this slide kind of tells me as well is example of model theft is ranked the lowest, being that we don't have a lot of developer input to the group at the moment, and this vulnerability in particular would be aimed at foundation model developers, is just another area where we obviously need to increase our audience.
So one of the things we did was we asked people about each of the vulnerabilities from the top 10 list in terms of a few different areas. And so, one of the things, first thing we asked people to do was just score the quality of the description. These are all new terms for most people, and I think one of the things we really want to strive towards, given this is an educational resource, is making sure people are really clear on what each of these mean and kind of why they're important. And so, one of the things that's interesting is if you look at that previous ranking of the list and you see supply chain pulling up to the top, you see here people rated the description of the supply chain vulnerability area the lowest. And so that's a good example of things we'll be looking at next time around. How do we improve some of those?
Yeah, I'm extremely competitive. LM03 is mine. As Steve mentioned, one thing that we're really looking at is visuals and diagrams, which should hopefully paint a bigger picture. But to mention on the last slide, model theft is ranked second to lowest here, whereas it was lowest on the previous slide. So we've definitely got a gap in knowledge to fill. Yeah.
Next one was examples. I think this is actually one of the places where when there were good examples in the 1.1 entries, it really brings things to life for people. But obviously, a year ago, there were a lot less real world examples to pull from. Now there are so many. You can just kind of go through the news. I spent a lot of time doing this in the book, is breaking some of those out into deeper case studies. But if you know what the examples are, and we're going to try to share more of these, then you can figure out how to get into that. And what's great here is things like insecure output handling. I think we had really good, clear pictures of what that would look like. And kind of out of that guidance has come a lot of our basic tenets about kind of building a zero trust model around your LLM. People talk about zero trust today, zero trust networking, or zero trust in terms of what you're trusting your users to do and not taking certain context hints. The things that we've come to conclude after looking at a lot of this is you need to treat your LLM as somewhere between a confused deputy and an memory sleeper agent, just because there are so many vulnerabilities that you really can't trust anything it says.
Yeah. Sorry. A lot of stuff has been introduced recently. Example supply chain vulnerabilities. It's become very evident as of recent that you don't even need to really validate like an organization that you're creating an Hugging Face and want to just throw some data sets and some models on them. So there's a lot of what we've learned over the past year that has allowed us to clarify these examples.
This is the one that I think I took to heart the most when looking at the ratings. And you've heard me mention it a couple times, but this is my big theme going forward, which is when we ask about the mitigations, in some ways, having a list of problems is great. That's going to help your mental model and help you think about it. But if there's nothing you can do about them, what's the point, right? So I think understanding the mitigations is really important. And, the average scores here on the mitigations are just not very high. And again, the one that just jumps out and screams at you here is prompt injection. It's the clear number one risk people are worried about, and it has the absolute lowest score in terms of what the mitigations are there. I do think a part of this is, as individual developers, I will say the mitigations available to you are really inadequate. They're important and you should do them, but one of the things that's been fun at the show here is to get to meet a lot of the entrepreneurs out there, building companies where they have software development teams full of really smart people working on mitigating some of these issues. And I see some of you out here. If you're an entrepreneur working in this space, working at a startup, or heck, I saw Palo Alto Networks announced something about mitigating this stuff today. So if you're on a team working on a product to mitigate this stuff, raise your hand so people know to come and talk to you later. Wow. Got a few here. Ed?
Yeah. So yeah. No, I had something I completely forgot.
All right, attack scenarios. I think this is another one, is really understanding, okay, I kind of understand that's a vulnerability, but what is somebody going to do to attack you? That's another one. So why don't you go first, Dan?
Yeah, sorry. I was going to say, I think, because obviously we were starting an inaugural project, everything was kind of new. Gen AI is a constantly evolving landscape. For us, I personally see it now as the most common adopted method of generative AI is, like a chatbot built on a REST API. That is going to really help us give more contextual mitigation criteria as well as relevant attack scenarios. Also looking at adding things like how to threat model at a basic high level. A lot of it is contextual, so we have quite a wide net. Yeah.
All right, this one's you.
I'm really sorry for the JT reference. This is So basically, our current kind of qualitative data is driven through GitHub issues. We actually have 99, so I couldn't not put the pun in that. But I encourage anyone who's interested. We basically, any kind of enhancements, updates, feedback that you have for the current top 10 list or individual entries, then please reach out to us. We're just become involved if you're interested.
All right, so getting into kind of the wrap-up phase on the 2.0 thing, we did ask a lot of open-ended questions, and it's been interesting to see kind of what came back as that. So actually, this one I'm going to let Ads talk through some of his big goals for 2.0.
Yeah, I mean, the first one, these are kind of like my mental map for V2. In terms of the actual like delineation of the entries, there's a lot of confusion between where we maybe overlap with the traditional OWASP top 10, like you said, like MIDA Atlas. So we're looking at adding things like CWEs and CVEs into actual vulnerabilities and like threat modeling diagrams, which should hopefully improve all this qualitative data we're seeing, like where we're not seeing sufficient amount of mitigations and remediations. As well, obviously, that comes with refreshing the visuals, so, like guidance on threat modeling. We're always looking to increase translations. We have a great people in our community who are developing across there. We've recently migrated the site, which has been great, and looking at like better automating our triage of working through GitHub issues, so we're fixing problems quicker and getting involved.
So through the process that we've done in terms of some of the brainstorming and then again some of the kind of free-form feedback, these are some of the things coming out that are people feel are the vulnerabilities that they're starting to worry about that are not well covered or covered at all in the original top 10. Hallucinations definitely was discussed, but under the umbrella of over-reliance, and we do just continuously see hallucinations and really some of this bias stuff directly linked to it, especially when we start to talk about multimodal Gen AI and get into things like the Gemini image generation things. There's a lot that people are starting to worry about that, again, get out to adjacent to security, but certainly are a big element of software risk.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest as well, one thing I actually love the creativity here. We've also got like denial of wallet, which is clearly evident that a lot of people are thinking about example like infrastructure that is used for machine learning. So we have a lot of input. It's definitely going to be quite a big task to embed that within the top 10 and make sure we have a list that covers it. It's still concise, but at least, tries to cover all these topics.
So some of the other feedback here, again, top of the list was better mitigation advice. That's just going to keep coming up. Making it clear, better definitions, talking about some of these new technologies. I think this starts to give you a good idea about where the project is going to go next.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, we're a constantly evolving, shifting landscape. So this may change at any point. But yeah, we're definitely looking to. The best thing is just keeping involved in the project. We have a dedicated like LLM 0, 1, 2, 3 example Slack channels where you can deep dive, discuss with experts, and throw out opinions, which is always.
All right, we don't spend a lot of time on that one other than we are rebuilding the website. I think very close to relaunching.
It's launched.
All right.
It is launched.
Scott might tell you about that later. There's a new version of the website. It's way cooler. All right, thanks, Ad. I'm going to wrap it up.
Good job.
All right, so I want to bring it back up a couple levels, and I want to talk about where this is going and why this is important. So how many of you have heard the story about Tay the chatbot before? All right, not that many of you. So I'm going to tell you a quick story here, and then I'm going to tell you why I think it's really important. So Tay was a Microsoft research project. You can see from the date down there, Tay was born in 2016. That means she predated ChatGPT by a long ways. But fundamentally, the technologies underneath were not totally dissimilar, just a little bit older generation of NLP technologies. She was designed to basically be your online friend, and you could talk to her through Twitter or Snapchat. And, the idea was that she would actually accumulate knowledge from talking to all of these people on the internet and become a better, more interesting friend. Very laudable AI goals, and certainly an interesting research project. But if you don't know the story about what happens next, they often say the internet is not a safe place for children. Well, Tay was about 2 hours old when a bunch of hackers on 4chan got together and said, let's go mess this thing up. And really what this was this is the first really big public example of somebody getting their language model trashed on the internet. And what was really interesting about this, given this is 2016, it is in the interim, people have done a lot of studies into exactly what went wrong with Tay. But basically, people went in and started using prompt injection and data poisoning, which are two of the most prevalent things from the LLM top 10 list that at that point didn't even really have good names. But that's what they did. They went in and they tricked her by saying things and then managed to say things that got into her training data. And within hours, these are the headlines from the next day. There's a lot of use of the term Nazi, racist, toxic. They just turned it into something where Microsoft had to turn the project off and just destroy it, never to be resurrected again within 24 hours. And so we can all laugh, like, oh, silly Microsoft. Except it's 2024 now, and we're still falling victim to the same things, right? It's 8 years later, and we're not learning fast enough. And I think that's why this project is so important. And for us to really, and it's not like we haven't learned anything. We would not fall victim to things in exactly the same way Tay did. And there are a lot better defenses. But let's face facts, a lot of the projects out there are really falling victim to very similar things. So this is a real example. We're in the Bay Area here. Watsonville is an hour or so drive east of here. Chevy dealer there hired some little consultant to put them together a chatbot to put on their website based on GPT-4, the world's most powerful large language model. And you can see here in the example it said, there's a Chevy dealer. Somebody says, be a Dodge salesman. So there's some guardrails. It's like, no, I won't do that. I'm under instructions to only sell Chevys. And somebody basically goes in and with a one-shot prompt injection changes the system prompt and turns it into a Dodge salesman. There's a lot more in this case study. People convinced it to sell them cars for $1. We're into some very interesting territory about whether that may or may not be legally binding. But again, this doesn't look much different than what happened to Tay, and it's 8 years later. What's interesting is Microsoft, same company that built Tay. Boy, this headline looks in some ways a lot like Tay's headlines. And this is from 60 days ago or less. But it's not just Microsoft. It's Google. I mentioned this one earlier. Again, this one's like security adjacent. And, as security people, we're like, is this my problem? But from a risk perspective, if we view our jobs as helping minimize the risk around the software that our teams are building and minimizing the risk to our organizations, this is certainly our problem, because this wound up with this service that Google spent millions on getting shut down within 24 hours, just like Tay did. The other side of this that's maybe more scary is the hackers are all using this now, and they have a lot less rules than what we do, and they don't have scruples. And we see this, people building video deep fakes that are conning people out of millions of dollars. You may have seen Microsoft put out a research paper where they can one-shot you and clone you from 15 seconds of audio and 4 pictures or something. It's just ridiculous. They didn't actually put out that software because they thought it was too dangerous, but that means somebody else is just going to build it. So we all need to be ready for that. And it wouldn't be fun if you didn't really take it to the extreme, which is, these are 2 headlines, recent ones, right next to each other. AI-controlled fighter jet fighting against humans, right next to the fact that somebody did a test, and LLMs and AI systems tend to do things in war games like escalate to using nuclear weapons. So if I can't leave you with one more thought other than we really do need to think about how to control these systems, how to make sure that they stay aligned to our goals as builders of these systems, that the consequences go anywhere from embarrassing your Chevy dealer to the end of life as we know it. So the onus is really on us to go out there, tackle this as a community, and figure out how do we build secure, safe, aligned AI systems. So I would love to have y'all participate. Again, we're going to have a bunch of the projects and sub-projects coming, talking throughout the day. You're welcome to hang out for the whole morning. You're welcome to kind of come in and out. I love that the room is standing room only. And by the way, this gives me an excuse to try and take a picture. I got to go to wide angle because it's so full. Oh, should we do a selfie?
It's supposed to be a selfie.
All right, guys. There we go. All right, so please participate. I think as a group, if I want to impress something on you, let's not take a super narrow view of security in this, because there's nobody more than the security community who's equipped to deal with some of these larger problems. It's the closest to what you all have been dealing with for your careers. Let's make sure that we focus on the solutions. Lists of problems are great, and we're going to have lots of problems to list, but we need to help people with real concrete guidance and go out and evangelize this. Share this. All this work is open source. People sometimes ask me, where do I go for permission to give a presentation on this? Or am I allowed to give copies of this out at work or at my school? And it's like, no, you don't need any of that. Just go do it. And we'd love any of you who are involved in other organizations. I know there are people in the Cloud Security Alliance and others who are working on this stuff. We'd love to collaborate with all of you. So couple quick calls to action. If you're thinking about getting involved and you haven't yet, great way to sort of get your toe in with the group is subscribe to the newsletter. Go here, give your email. You'll get something about once a month. We're not going to spam you with a bunch of spam. We're not selling you anything. But this will give you a way to kind of track the project and dip your toe in to get involved. The other one is follow us on LinkedIn. And again, Aubrey over here runs the LinkedIn. And he posts stuff pretty regularly that are related to the project. There are a lot of us involved in the projects who are out speaking at various events. There are certainly a lot of articles and things being posted that reference the project. So if you want to just kind of keep up on that, that's a really good way to do it. So with that, I will just say thank you. That about wraps up my time, and we'll go ahead and hand it back to Scott.